When the town smells like cinnamon, you know someone just died. I've lived in this town named Talto since the moment I was born, when everything smelled like nutmeg. It's quite a beautiful place. Everyone that lives here is being gifted with anything they could ever wish for. Each family has a big house with enough rooms so that generations can live together if they wish to. They receive a car, although that one is quite unnecessary if you ask me. No one ever leaves anyway, and the town is small enough that a bike would be more than enough. If you want to take a stroll down the town center, you can easily do so on foot. You can watch all the little shops and restaurants. Each and every place is an individual masterpiece run by important members of the community. There is a flower shop growing the most peculiar plants with the brightest colors. There is a store making booths that will make you want to start dancing and never stop. There is a jewelry store with diamonds you have never seen before. However, the most important place, the one that makes our town what it is Mrs. Holly's wonderful bakery. Mrs. Holly is an old woman with rosy cheeks and purple dresses. She likes to sing as she bakes the most delicious pastries, bread, and biscuits. Stepping foot into that wonderful bakery will never want to make you leave again. Unfortunately, we are not allowed to buy any of the things produced, not from the bakery or any of the other special shops. The goods are made for export. There is something particularly interesting taking place in the peculiar place we call Talto. You see, every time a child is brought to life in our small little hospital, the town smells of nutmeg. When someone dies, it smells of cinnamon. That's because as soon as the news reaches the lovely Mrs. Holly, she will start baking a batch of pastry, making sure everyone in town can smell that we gained or lost a member. This is something we have all grown accustomed to, and we wouldn't want it any other way. The smell of the town can tell you a lot about its history, you see. Paris smells like butter, Berlin smells like iron, and Naples smells like basil. Well, I have never been to any of those places myself, so I couldn't tell you for sure, but this is how my grandfather would describe them. He liked explaining the world with his nose. My grandfather was the most remarkable person I knew, and one of the very few people who were allowed to leave the town from time to time. He was an exporter. I still remember the day he was taken away. The cinnamon never smelled sweeter. Talto is a special place. The people who have the honor of living here are never short of anything they could wish for. But of course, this life of ease and peace comes with a price. If you live here, you need to stick to our rules. They are not many, and it's not that difficult to oblige. You just need to be willing enough. For example, if you want to live in Talto, you need to work. When a child reaches a certain age, it is assigned to a new job. As I said, we have many special shops. I know, it sounds a little strange. The town committee always says that everything needed is provided for us. If we ever wanted more, it meant we were greedy and not worthy of living in this little paradise. I never understood much about our ideals. You work all your life, but are not allowed to buy anything? It felt strange to me, but my parents taught me from an early age that I needed to follow the rules. Now that I am old enough to work, I was assigned to my first job. I assumed I would have to work in the toothpaste factory together with Mom and Dad. The toothpaste that makes your teeth go all black and achy, but instead I got a much better job. One that every child in town could only dream of. I would be working in Mrs. Holly's bakery. Deborah, oh please. Come in, come in. Mrs. Holly greeted me with a warm smile. It was so early in the morning, the sky was still black, but I knew better than to be late on my first day of work. Morning, Mrs. Holly, and thank you so much for hiring me. I was a little afraid of what other job I might get. She gave me a sympathetic smile and waved me inside. She handed me my very own apron as we walked to the back of the bakery. I usually work alone, but I heard a rumor that they wanted to assign you to be a shoe tester, and I really wouldn't have wanted your feet to fall off. I furrowed my brow. Why would my feet fall off? Oh, honey, the committee heard about some city somewhere in the States where the people are apparently dancing even when they shouldn't. Now they want to punish them, so produce increased. They need testers to see if the new shoes work accordingly. Right, I mumbled. All the products were created so someone somewhere could be punished. Don't ask me why. The committee seems to have very clear ideas on how the world should look like. You know, your grandfather was a good friend of mine. I always had a sweet spot for you, my dear. Your parents were smart only to have one child, some people here. She stopped talking and smiled at me as if she had almost said something she shouldn't. Anyway, I was just starting to make a batch of snickerdoodles. Why don't you help me with that? Who died? I blurted out. You know the Trottles, right? Well, their oldest son fell in love with Jenny Jenkins. Apparently, he tried getting her a ring. Poor fool. He knew what would happen if they found out. The longer I worked at Mrs. Holly's bakery, the more I started understanding what was actually taking place in our town. The factories and shops were creating something awful. Everyone that was old enough knew about it, but they chose to ignore it, even if they all had different reasons. Life here was really perfect. You never had to fear for anything as long as you worked and didn't take any of the products from the forbidden shops. There were enough stores giving out legal things for free. The house, the car, the food, the drinks, the entertainment, and everything else you could imagine. Anything that was given to the people for free was a way to make them live happily and not start asking questions. As there was another rule. Never ask questions. What did my grandpa do? I know I wasn't allowed to ask. Mrs. Holly could hit me, hurt me, make them burn me, but somehow I couldn't keep myself from blurting out those words. I kept asking myself this question each time I smelled cinnamon. Besides, Mrs. Holly and I had grown closer. I felt like I could trust her. When I said those words, her eyes opened wide with terror. Child, are you insane? Don't you know that? I'm not supposed to ask questions. I know. But you know, the other day they took Timmy, my neighbor. He was such a kind and sweet person. They assigned him to the crematory and he said no. So they threw him in. I don't know what befell me. Maybe it was the fact that I was getting older, or maybe the bakery made me feel dumb and brave. Timmy wasn't the only one they took. Just the one that hurt me the most. He was a kind boy. Mrs. Holly sighed. Your grandfather didn't do his job. He was supposed to travel and sell, but instead, he destroyed the products. He still got the money in different ways, but the committee found out that he was tricking them. This is all I will say, and don't ever ask or question anything again. She got the wooden rolling pin from the desk. I saw the pain in her eyes as she held it up and hit my arm with all her strength. They probably heard what I asked, and they know if she didn't do it properly. I knew she didn't want to hurt me, but it was my own fault for asking questions. The broken hand was worth the information she gave me. Besides, my punishment could have been much worse. I thought I understood tattletale, but simple answers can never answer complicated questions. I understand that now. For a long time, I thought it was the smell. The nutmeg would make you happy, the cinnamon would teach you to fear. Except I spent every day in the bakery surrounded by the smells, and only now I'm starting to become skeptical. I'm starting to doubt and to understand. And nutmeg doesn't make anyone happy. Too much of it can even become poisonous. There was a time where I was afraid of Mrs. Holly and the smell of cinnamon. To me, it meant death. Now I understand that Mrs. Holly isn't trying to scare everyone by alarming them with the smell. She is trying to cover up the smell of burning corpses. I don't even want to imagine how many snickerdoodles she had to bake after they burnt all her children and husband when they tried to leave the town. I am a child psychiatrist, and there is something very off about the kid I am treating. To say Ethan was the smartest 12-year-old I've ever met would be an understatement. According to his school records, his first stroke of genius hit around the time he was in second grade, when he multiplied 3-digit numbers in his head while the other kids were just learning to add using their fingers. He has always been fascinated by mathematics, particularly probability, which wasn't even covered in the syllabus yet. His teacher immediately requested Ethan's parents to consider him skipping a few grades, maybe even take a few tests to see if he was a genius. The Jones were against that idea completely. They just thought it would be too much work in their already hectic life. However, the absolute lack of attention or love from Ethan's parents isn't the reason why he is in my office every day at 4 p.m. sharply. Frankly, I don't think that bothers him. He's not all too popular in school either, considering no kids wants to be friends with a know-it-all that could predict the outcome of Monopoly with the help of some probability. That's not what we're addressing here either. Ethan has been sent to me because he was the only one present at the crime scene when his 19-year-old babysitter Kristen was brutally murdered by the serial killer who had escaped from jail a couple of weeks ago and was on a killing spree. Well, he wasn't exactly a witness because while Kristen's head was being badgered with a hammer, Ethan was too busy counting the tiles on the bathroom floor. It was unfortunate really, but fate would have it that Kristen met the pattern of this rogue killer's previous victims. The Jones returned home to a bloody corpse in the middle of their living room and their young boy seated on a chair in the dining hall, playing on his iPad. It was Mrs. Jones that believed her son required a psychiatrist given God knows what he might have witnessed that evening. She wanted to ensure if he was still normal. My sessions with Ethan haven't really been all that fruitful. I tried to keep the conversation going many times, but all I get in return were a few shrugs and maybe a half-hearted yeah now and then. Today, however, I decided to dive right in and talk about that gruesome evening. It was a dark time for the entire town, you know, I spoke. The police didn't see it coming, nobody did. What were the chances? I did. A voice. A sentence. That was a breakthrough for me. What's that? I had seen the man come to our house and stare every evening for a week. Ethan spoke. Who? I pressed. The bad man who killed Kristen. I would see him from the bedroom window. I knew the police were looking. I saw the news and I knew he was going to do something bad. I also knew he would have done it on a Tuesday or a Wednesday because that's when Mom and Dad don't come home for a long time. Ethan continued. The chances were 2 out of 7. I felt a chill go down my spine. It was peculiar to see a child talk about such an event with not even a hint of remorse. Why? I began. Why didn't you say anything? You could have saved her life. Kristen never liked when I spoke about math. She called it weird, Ethan replied. Besides, I wanted to see if I was right. The man's ad offered $5,000 to sit in a chair and stare at him. The ad offered $5,000 and said that the desired activity could be completed in an hour. It stated, fairly redundantly, that it was not a sexual thing, insisted that all the witness would need to do is sit in a chair and stare ahead. The only other details expressed were that you could not move during the experience, nor could you talk, this inability being out of requested self-restraint, not through a means of physical prevention. Being an abysmally broke college student and having a friend with whom I could depend upon for my rescue if something strange happened, I answered the ad only a few minutes after coming across it. The person who had put out the ad had provided a phone number, which I called. Sending a text resulted in me being informed that it was a landline. The person answered, and we briefly discussed the location where the interaction was to be held, and I confirmed the amount of money to be paid. Like his ad, he repeatedly reminded me that it was in no way a carnal activity. Apparently, he'd gotten a lot of answers to the ad from people with that particular preconception. My friend took the day off from work, insisted, despite my protests, that we could wait until the following day when he was off, and we drove to the agreed-upon location. It was a house in a suburban neighborhood, which was somewhat comforting. If the man was an axe murderer, there was a chance my screams of terror could be heard by quite a few people. I joked a lot about this, but my friend didn't find it funny. The ad specified and the man reiterated that I'd be alone when entering the house, so I had my friend stay in the car. Being similarly broke, I offered him $500 for his help, an unnecessary incentive, his words, to not leave me if the man turns out to be truly insane. I got out of the car and walked across the lawn, which, unlike those of other houses, hadn't been maintained. The grass was high, weeds threatened to burst through the concrete of the driveway and sidewalk. The man had sounded fairly old on the phone, so I attributed the ill-maintained property to an inability to perform the duties rather than some indication of insanity. I was instructed to immediately enter once I had arrived, so I didn't bother knocking. The unlocked door opened into a foyer, and connected to this was a hall that led into a kitchen. The hall held a single door, which I assumed led into a closet or down to a basement. Leftward from the kitchen was a spacious room devoid of furnishing save for 2 steel foldable chairs and an equally foldable dinner table. The foyer, hall, and kitchen were in similar states of bareness, and are worth remarking on beyond that. Sitting in one of the chairs in the great room was a man, who I knew at once to be the dealer of the ad. There was a certain familiarity about him, one of those times when a voice is an almost eerie reflection of the person from whom it issued. He nodded and gave a wave, but it did not speak. I approached and sat down at the chair opposite him. To my left on the dinner table was a box. The top of the box was a clear case, through which a neat stack of money could be seen. The base of the box was black, with a timer at its face, and a clasping mechanism which sealed the upper portion to the bottom. It is a time-release device. Now that you're here, I will start it, he immediately does, and once an hour has passed from this point, the box will open, and you are free to take your payment. You needn't say anything once that time arrives, and can depart a slightly richer person. Now, all you must do is look at me. You may of course blink, but please do not speak or look away. It's very important that you be both silent and still. And so, the staring session began. It was expectedly awkward for the first few minutes. He stared right back at me, but after a while the oddness of the circumstances became dull, and I grew accustomed to them. His face wasn't unusual, but it wasn't exactly handsome, easy enough to look at, but not someone you would have necessarily wanted to linger on without incentive. He was about 65, hair grayed and thin, face starting to sag, blue eyes slightly squinting, visual acuity no doubt dwindling. Despite his incessant assertions to the contrary, I couldn't help but think that he derived some abstract sexual amusement from this. Some sort of staring into the eyes of your lover thing. But despite the incredibly uncomfortable experience of that hour, soon to be described, he at no point exhibited any behavior which would suggest arousal. About 10 minutes in, the strangeness of the experience was doubled. From below and then far behind me I heard a shifting clamor, as if a group of people had ascended the basement stairs and gathered just before the kitchen, chatting excitedly. I was going to turn, the ad hadn't mentioned the presence of others, but the man's eyes seemed to almost plead with me to remain focused on him. He didn't speak a word, though. Resisting instinct, I kept my gaze fixed on him and listened to the noise of the crowd behind me. The weird thing was that while I could hear them talking, and even mentally differentiate between speakers, I couldn't understand a single word that was spoken. They had moved into the kitchen by this point, but none of the words were intelligible to me. And even weirder was that it was obvious they were speaking English. I could recognize the nuance and structure of the language. The man's eyes imparted nothing beyond the unspoken insistence that I keep mine on him. My inability to recognize the words which were clearly English troubled me gravely, and I started saying words in my head to reassure myself that I had not somehow forgotten the language. I couldn't check exactly how much time had passed, the timer being too far out of my peripheral vision, but about 40 minutes into the experience the voices were right behind me, in the great room. There were perhaps 12 distinct voices, all chattering and laughing and speaking some unrecognizable variants of a language I'd been speaking for nearly 2 decades. Women, men, and children conversed just behind me, not a single one, for even a moment, being understandable. I was terrified. Their appearance and migration from the basement to right behind me was strange, yes. But the possibility that something was wrong with me, that I might have had some sort of stroke or neurological slip-up, was far worse. My eyes had stayed on the man, but my mind had momentarily receded, turning over these bleak possibilities. Upon returning my focus to the man, I saw that he was crying. Inaudibly, of course, but the tears were there, the lips slightly quivering. Instinct almost compelled me to ask what was wrong, but I stopped myself. both for the sake of the experience and a new fear that speaking would somehow draw the attention of the partiers to me. And for some inexpressible reason, I was sure that getting their attention wasn't something I wanted. A new terror dawned then. What if the group continues their movement and they press forward, swarming around us? With each second that passed, I grew more certain that seeing these people would cause something horrible to happen. Their voices did grow louder, but no closer in proximity. I started to shake, my heartbeat quickened, and my breathing became labored. I tried to calm myself, but the presence of those people behind me was so dreadful in a way that I still cannot find the words to properly describe. Against my control, as I shuddered, I let out a low moan. It was barely audible, more of a release of air than proper emission of the vocal cords. But the man's eyes grew wide with terror, and from behind me, for the first time, I heard something I couldn't understand. "Oh, would someone like to join the party?" I froze in place, even my heart seemed to quiet its movement. The noise behind me still continued, but with considerably less people causing it. The attention of several members had apparently been drawn from the conversation. Drawn to me. I became like a statue, not even allowing myself to blink. The man's eyes remained wide, but he'd stopped crying. He stared at me with what I can only describe as mindless terror. Despite my earlier belief that seeing these people would bring about some horrible event, I tried to see within his eyes even a dim reflection of the scene behind me. But nothing was reflected, not even his thoughts. I could have sworn I heard a request to join the party. A woman's voice. Think it was one of dear old Dad's friends? A man's voice. Ah, that old fool couldn't keep a friend if his life depended on it. You two sure saw to that. A third voice, another man. A chorus of disconcerting laughter erupts. Oh well, shall we go back downstairs? The others who hadn't spoken seemed to respond in agreement, although I couldn't understand them. As gradually as they had come, the voices went away, returning downstairs and eventually fading to inaudibility. A few minutes later, the timer beside us went off, indicating that the hour had passed. The man almost collapsed at this moment, sagging back in his seat and breathing raggedly. I went to help him, but he held up a hand, dismissing me. Before I could say anything, he cried out, "Thank you," and repeated the same multiple times between breaths. He'd started crying again, although these tears seemed to be from relief.